Welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor, and we're back in Central Park at Columbus Circle. And we've got a morning painting, a morning session. My first recording there didn't finish so well. What I mean by that is the technical difficulties. Anyway, I'm going to kind of repeat what I talked about and show you the painting that came out of that. So everybody gathered and we had a great start to the day. A lot of talk about yesterday and the fun that we had in Central Park, painting the various scenes. And today we're in the Columbus Circle, which is at the southwest end of the park. And there's a lot of interesting subject matter there. There's several sculptures. There's a monument to the sinking of the Maine. A lot of beautiful scenery. This is sort of the light that we had in the early morning. We did get glimpses of some bright sunlight on the scene, but in general it was a sort of plain, drab looking view that we had out at Columbus Circle. However, the shapes intrigued me, the shapes of the monument with the background of buildings, so I went to my iPad and did a small, quick sketch to separate these shapes tonally. If you looked at the photo, you noticed that they were all very much of a same tonality, kind of mid-gray. But here and there we did see the sun peek through and land on the monument, so I went with that fleeting impression and exaggerated that a bit. I decided to make the monument very bright against a dark mid-tone of buildings and a foreground of darker figures in a kind of shadowed area. This is something that happens often. You get a brief glimpse of a subject that you feel you would like to do, and but it's very temporary, and you can remember pieces of it, but there's a lot of improvisation involved, and improvisation asks us to use our imagination, asks us to use our memory of things that we may have painted before that were similar. And that's very much the sort of condition that I was painting from on this Tuesday morning at Columbus Circle. So after finishing my drawing and placing the figures of that reclining statue nestled against the monument and light falling in the foreground, I could start to see the painting in my sketch and in my first washes. It started to reveal itself to me. That was, I credit my imagination, my ability to kind of, let's call it my mind's eye. In my mind's eye, I could see the painting already, so it was a matter of bringing that to life. And in doing so, I kind of removed myself from the scene. I would glance up occasionally for details that I needed, for especially the area you see me working in now, where I needed some strong brushwork to state this statue, this beautiful statue, with an economy of brushwork. If I could state this statue with some certain strokes, set it apart, and start to show the highlights, the rounded parts, the shadows of the statue with some degree of certitude, stating it in a way that looked like I could see it again as I wanted to see it, that is, with the sun striking it. Then I feel I could really go forward with the painting. So that's what I'm doing at this stage, putting down some simple strokes that I feel bring our statue to life. And it's not overly done, but enough to give us something to play off of. And that's what I'm going to do in these next washes, is start to realize the the shadow work behind. I would like to leave a little hint of the distant statue that rises on a pillar of Columbus looking out over the circle. as well as some of the public lighting, as well as some of the small figures that are moving off in the distance. So I'm going to be bringing a big wash. It's a large wash, and around these things that I just mentioned, around the statues, around the public lighting, and around some figures, coming close to the large statue that we just painted. And this, technically, what I'm doing is I'm creating a graded wash. You notice that I'm working into a very wet area, adding a variety of hues, but primarily I'm staying with burnt sienna and ultramarine blue to create a cool gray. I want this cool gray to kind of frame the main statue and at the same time give us a feeling of distance or depth to the buildings beyond. It's very much of a cavernous feeling, and I believe that a graded wash helps a lot to create this light bounce and a feeling of depth in the shadows. And so that's what I'm executing now. And a graded wash means moving the wash, transforming the wash from either light to dark or dark to light, warm to cool. It can be any sort of transformation that occurs along the length of the wash. So you see it going from the top of the page all the way down to sort of our eye level on the street. Some gaps here and there. This always seems to happen, and I leave these little spots, these little gaps in the wash, just to, some of them are intentional with the public lighting or the distant Statue of Columbus. Others are incidental, and I leave them until I decide they're going to be something, or I just wash a color over it and push them into the distance. But I think you can see in my first wash the slow transition from warm to cool and from light to dark, and it creates a feeling of depth. And I continue to work this until I'm relatively happy. I feel technically we can work this sort of wash while it's glistening. You see the page is just glistening now. We can continue to add, we can continue to lighten or adjust in all sorts of ways while the wash is very wet, and it's going to dry in a pleasing manner. It's not going to dry in a fragmented, streaky manner. So I brought this wash to my eye level, basically, my eye level, and watching it I'm watching it very closely to see how the color runs down, and if I feel it's reached a point that I like, I'll flatten out the page, because now, up till now, I've been working on an angle. I'll flatten the page a little bit so that it doesn't run down as much anymore. And I'm going to take also this opportunity, while the page is still very wet, to add some of the distant trees. I didn't do this in the first painting, but in the second painting I'm adding these trees because they provide some relief, some starker contrast against the statues, and again helps me to create some nuance or some change in the background wash. And I'm doing this with a technique that we call dry into wet, where I have a pretty thick paint on the brush, and I'm painting into a wet area. So these marks that I'm making, they're going to stay where they are. They're not going to drift down like that first wash that I painted. Anyway, you can see how the foreground is coming out now. This background wash is really pushing it forward and making the sunlight feel very strong. And this is what I had in my mind's eye, in my imagination. This is what I was sort of envisioning. So I'm pleased with it to this point. I've got to refine the foreground. I've got to do some detail work here and there, and also add a feeling of the buildings to this wash that's in the background after it's dried. I decided to extend some of that wash to the right in the form of dappled shadows. This inspiration came to me as I was looking at it and felt there needed to be some something quiet up above in the right-hand corner, because it was kind of pulling our eye out of the painting. The composition that you see is a classic inverted L composition. I saw that in my subject and decided to stay with that. I think it works well to kind of isolate our main subject, and at the same time gives us an opportunity to do a lot of things in the background. We can be very quiet and suggestive, moody, and not really overly compete with what's going on in the foreground. And I really wanted to get away from that monotone view that we had of gray upon gray upon gray, and wanted to create a more luminous version of the scene. So it's got quite a bit of contrast. Maybe ending up to be too much, but this is all to make a point that we can go beyond what we see and develop the painting according to our inner vision, the way that we would like to see it, the way that maybe we just got a fleeting glimpse of something that looked very beautiful, and in a moment it's gone. We can bring that to life in our painting if we're thoughtful and if we exercise our memory and our imagination. So that's what I'm doing in this work. Now I'm starting to work in the foreground, placing of figures, a number of figures. You can see them in the first washes. I placed them with a bit of cad red. I'm going back in now with the warm gray of burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine blue, and starting to define the main figures. The challenge here is I don't want the figures to take over the painting. I want them to kind of help in framing this passage of light that's behind them. So I'm painting them rather flatly. There's not a lot of detail, and while I may add some small details, some small things in the finished work, at this stage they're very much silhouettes, and this helps to take attention away from them. It helps to kind of frame the main passage of light that's behind, give some feeling of the scale, the immensity of this statue, and also give a feeling of life and the kind of energy that we see at the Columbus Circle. It's a very busy place, getting busier by the moment as we get into the day. And all of us are trying to pick up on that energy, primarily by using figures moving through our scene. Working on a very refined area around the statue, the edges of the statue. I want them to feel rounded and not cut out and pasted onto the painting. So I've got to place some softness on the forms. I've got to do a number of things within the statue itself to integrate it a little better into the whole painting, so that it feels immersed in light and yet a part of the air, or the quality of the air of the painting. What you see me doing now is bringing some buildings into the scene. What I mean by that are an idea of windows, strokes that create a feeling of perspective. It's really, the scene that we're looking at is very much like almost like a canyon. The buildings go off the page. They're huge, as you know if you've visited New York. They're just you're dwarfed by all the architecture. I'm not painting specific buildings, but using this idea of strokes at an angle to give me a sense of the angle of the building to the circle, how the circle is created through the placement of buildings. And I don't want much more than that. I'm not painting individual buildings. I'm painting the sense that this is an enclosed area almost, with a lot of shadows in the lower part of the enclosure. You can see the Columbus statue now kind of glowing in the distance, and trees underneath. And then you see some of those broken lights of public lighting, and as it comes down, we start to feel more cabs and so on. What I've just done is applied another shadow to the foreground. But I started that shadow with a very wet passage so that I had a soft transition, adding some cooler hues into the figures, and it's starting to have that finished look. I'll do a few more odds and ends. I'll add some highlights to the pole in the back that has the public lighting. I'll add some smaller figures in the form of opaque color, a few pigeons here and there, and little details to the figures in the foreground. I'm cautious to put too much in the foreground. I want it to be a buffer and sort of a frame to the main subject of the painting. So this is a redo, but I think it is successful in communicating those lessons of how we can work with tonal values to bring out the subject more than it appears when we look when it's in front of us. If we have a gray day, we can take liberties with that and employ our artistic vision to bring about a more contrasted subject simply by varying the tonal values. The shapes have remained the same, all the references to the motif of rape remained the same, but I made a play with tonal values and tried to bring out a feeling of a direct light on Columbus Circle.